Welcome back, everybody. We are finally closing out on these classes here. In today's section, we're going to be talking about this concept of development with our self, identity, and personality. This area and all of these topics within this area is very integrated, and there's a lot of links between some past stuff and some of the topics that we're going to be discussing within each of the sections here today. A lot of these topics apply to all of us, and actually a lot of these topics are things that are affecting most of you on this very day. So please try to relate some of the things that we're talking about today to your own life, and it should make this a lot more enjoyable section. To start off this class and this idea of describing the self, what I thought we'd do today is have a brief little activity. And in this activity, what I want you to do is to pretend, or if you actually are single, acknowledge that you're single, and pretend that you're going to be set up on a date. So you've got a friend of a friend who would like to set you up on this blind date. But we're also going to either pretend or acknowledge that you're probably the type of person that's very hesitant to go out on a date with somebody that you've never met. So you contact this individual in this hypothetical situation and agree with them to provide the other person with a little bit of information about yourself. The first thing that they ask for is a picture of you. And obviously, in today's age, you know how to present a very representative picture of yourself, like the one you probably see in the lower left-hand corner. So you provide a picture like that, but you also provide a brief description about who you are. Now, this idea of providing a brief description of who you are is sometimes a little awkward, sometimes a little difficult to do, but most of you probably know exactly how you would describe yourself, how you would actually let them know about the real you in writing. And what I'd like you to do for the next few minutes is pretend that you're going to go out on this date, pretend that you're going to write up this thing, and actually write up a description of who you are. So take a few minutes, write down everything that you can think of that you would probably want to convey to this person. And in the next slide, after doing this, we're going to go over what probably is in that description that you just came up with. Now, when we look at your description, there's a chance that maybe your descriptors don't fit all of the specific things that we're going to talk about here, but 99% of the time, or just a large percentage of the time, when we look at how people describe themselves and how you probably described yourself in this situation, even though these descriptors vary from person to person, and there's a lot of personal experiences and very self-based ideas that kind of pop up, these descriptors typically have a very set number of themes that come with them. One of the things that we see in these descriptors very, very often, especially in the situation that we just came up with, was that a lot of people, when describing themselves, like to do it by detailing physical features. So how we look, how tall we are, what our weight is, what our hair color is, what our eye color is, all of these characteristics are a part of ourself, are a part of who we think we are. But in addition to those physical features, the more obvious things that we can typically use to describe ourselves, there's other things that very commonly emerge in these descriptions. One of the things that commonly emerges is this concept of something called an identity, a description of who you actually are. And who you are entails a lot of different things. It entails what your roles are, what your job is, what your responsibilities are. It also details your likes and your dislikes, and the things that you tend to do and the things that you tend to avoid. And it also probably details some events of your life. So those experiences that you had in high school, or where you went, or where you're from, or who you're friends with, all pops up in that description of the self. And when you're going out on these hypothetical blind dates, these things pop up, but it's also when you're interacting with individuals, when you're thinking about who you are, this concept of the identity also should constantly be popping up. And this sense of identity, this sense of self, and where it comes from is what we're going to focus on in the first half of the class. But in addition to focusing on this idea of an identity, we also have another aspect that's popping up, and that's our personality. The collection of characteristics, descriptors of how we react to certain situations most of the time, is another thing that we typically display to people, or we typically tell people about. And we have a fairly accurate assessment of who we are most of the time with respect to this personality, because it's a part of us that we actually care about. And it's something that we have to understand as we age in order to effectively interact with our environment. And we're going to talk about how this concept of personality grows later on in the class. But before we talk about this idea of identity and this idea of personality, one thing that we have to talk about first is this overarching concept of self. Now, our self does entail a lot of things: physical characteristics, identity characteristics, personality characteristics, and probably a number of other additional things. But when we described ourselves, there's a couple things that needed to happen for us to be able to even understand what this task actually entailed. One of the first things that's required for us to do that task that we had in the beginning of class is that we have to be able to recognize that we are a unique individual, that there are specific characteristics that can be ascribed to us. And that recognition of those characteristics, that recognition that we need to pay attention to characteristics about ourselves, is something we call self-recognition. And when we look at development, and when we look at how the mind kind of picks up on this part of growth, what we see is that self-recognition is one of the first steps that we have to take in the developmental process in order to develop this current version of the self that we now have. Another thing that has to happen is that we have to start to be able to identify who we actually are. So not only do we have to see ourselves as unique, but we have to start to recognize some things that we can use to describe who we are. And we also typically have to recognize what really accentuates who we are. So some of us might really care about our height, or our age, or our personality style. And if those things are important, they're probably the first descriptors we usually go to when we describe ourselves to another individual. And that understanding, or that growth and understanding of who we are and what's really important, is another big step in the development of the self, and we call this self-understanding. When we look at this growth of these two concepts of the self and just the overall idea of the self, what we can see is that the developmental process actually is strongly linked to a number of concepts within the self. One of the first things we see in infancy is that even though at a young age this idea of the self doesn't make much sense because we don't have self-recognition yet, as children start to age, at a very, very young age in months, children typically start to gain a sense of self. So they start to recognize that they are a unique individual. And one of the first tests that actually verifies this recognition of the sense of self is the mirror task that was done originally by Jean Piaget on his young children. And in the mirror task, what researchers do is they place a red dot on the child's nose and place a mirror in front of the child. And before the child recognizes that they are a unique individual, they can recognize themselves and they have kind of consistent qualities, the child won't really recognize what that red dot actually signifies. So they'll see the red dot on the child's nose in the mirror, and they'll grab at the red dot in the mirror because they know that's not typical of most people's faces. But as a child starts to age, as the child starts to progress, Instead of reaching at the mirror when they see the red dot, they'll reach for their own nose. And that reaching for their own nose is an indication to most researchers that a child has started to develop a sense of self, that they realize that they are a unique individual, but one that also has consistent features and one that can be displayed in things like mirrors and other, let me think. Just that they are a unique individual that can be recognized in things like mirrors. After recognizing themselves, one of the other big things that starts to come up in a child's world that relates to self is the recognition that there are specific aspects of the world that belong to them, and there's specific aspects of the world that belong to others. So there's qualities that they possess that others don't possess, and there's objects that are theirs and objects that aren't theirs. And this recognition that there's other selves within the world and that there's other entities just like themselves is kind of the big final stage of growth in infancy that starts to form with respect to this idea of the self. After infancy, when we move in particular into early childhood, what we see is a transition of not only kind of a recognition of the self, but also recognition of specific aspects of the self. So kids start to recognize their own physical characteristics, like I have brown hair, or I have, a belly button. These particular physical characteristics, or even skills, basic skills, like I can tie my shoes, are typically how children perceive themselves. It's all in qualities, not personality, not in traits at this particular time. But with those descriptors, what we also see in early childhood is that a lot of times these descriptors aren't 100% accurate. So you might ask a young child if they can tie their shoes, and they'll say yes, even though they can't. But those inaccurate ones aren't nearly as obvious as some of the more dramatic ones. So you might have a child tell you that they can run 10 million miles because they just ran down the block. And a part of that lack of accuracy is based on just an inability to understand what 10 million miles are, but also based on an inability to really get an accurate sense of somebody's limitations. But even though there's inaccuracies, even though there's an inflated sense of self, these descriptors really show us that children are already grappling with this idea of the self at a very young age. Later on in childhood, when they get into around 4 or 5 years of age, you see also an emergence of personality descriptors as well. Now, these personality descriptors are very, very basic. So, I'm a good person, I'm smart. They don't go into subtle nuances about situational factors of things, but at least you start to see an emergence of a recognition of trends in behavior at this specific age. A final thing that starts to develop in our childhood, in particular late childhood, is that theory of mind that we talked about earlier. So not only do children recognize that their physical characteristics are different from other individuals, but their personality is also different from other individuals. And what we often see is kind of a correlational growth between a recognition of a child's own personality and theory of mind. So they recognize that they're consistent and that other people are consistent, but the consistencies might not always match from person to person. As we move through middle childhood into very late childhood, 6, 7 years of age, what we see is a very dramatic shift in the sense of self. So instead of focusing on just physical characteristics, psychological characteristics like intelligence, personality characteristics like overall positive, negative aspects to a child become much, much more prevalent in self-description. So we move from the physical to looking more at kind of comparative behaviors within a child. We also see that social roles start to play a very important role in a child's ability to describe who they are. And that's because partially kids are starting to fulfill specific social roles or recognize their social roles as they get to this age. So they recognize that they go to a specific elementary school. They recognize that they're friends with Billy and Bobby, and they recognize that they play on a basketball team and that they are so-and-so's brother or sister. And that recognition of those roles is a dramatic revelation to these young children. And it becomes, once they recognize these roles, a very prominent part of their self-descriptors as well. And what we also see within this is as children become more complex, so they start to recognize their personality, they start to recognize their social roles, another thing that tends to happen is they start to recognize their differences with other individuals. So they start not only seeing that they're different from so-and-so because of, their different personality or their different characteristics, but they also start to really qualify those differences between them and other people. So they not only recognize, say, the differences in heights or differences in friendliness or popularity, but they also recognize, that there's a qualitative difference between those individuals. So, Susie is much taller and much more athletic than me. I am much, funnier than Bobby. Or those types of comparisons are usually the things that really dominate a child's perspective of who they are. And with that comparative self also often emerges a new type of self called an ideal self, the person that we would like to be. And when we look at kind of the development of recognizing who we are and our social roles, we often see that kids also develop at the same time a perspective of who they'd like to be. So I would like to be taller. I would like to be smarter. I would like to be able to run faster. All of these kind of ideals tend to come hand in hand with the recognition of differences between a specific individuals and others. And because we kind of form those ideals, because we start to recognize comparative differences between us, we also tend to, in late childhood, get a little bit more accurate perception of who we are. So we don't have children, at least very often, thinking that they can run 10,000 miles, or that they can read when they actually can't. There's a real recognition of limitations once we get to this particular stage. We're still not 100% accurate in our self-descriptors. In fact, most of us never are. But at least we start slightly coming down to earth and recognizing some of our more basic limitations when we get into late childhood. After late childhood, moving into early and much later adolescence, what we see is a transition of the self from just focusing on kind of a couple aspects of things while interacting with the world to focusing on the self as being really the prominent concern in a lot of adolescents' lives. All right? Knowing who we are, trying to define who we are for other individuals, becomes a very, very important aspect of the social lives of adolescents. In fact, if you've ever been around an adolescent, oftentimes you can see them kind of toying with different types of selves, playing with different options, and trying to interact and fulfill those roles that they see themselves as, and really struggling with this definition of the self. And in attempts to define the self, one thing that becomes extremely important, even though it was already fairly prevalent at a young age, is this idea of social comparison. We want to know who we're better than, who we're worse than, who we're like, who we're not like or dissimilar from. And we really focus in on that as being a very critical thing at this particular age of social development. We also, at this age, as we mentioned, start to play with possible selves. So we're trying out different individuals, we're trying out different roles that we could possibly fulfill in an attempt, at least in theory, in an attempt to really understand who our true self actually is. And as we progress through adolescence, what we often see is a slow integration of different types of self. So our ideal self, that person we'd like to be, that actual self, that person we think we currently are, and our comparative self, that kind of recognition of who we are with respect to others. Well, those types of selves become much, much more coherent, and they become much more stable as we get into the later years of adolescence. When we reach adulthood, what we often see is that sense of self that we had in adolescence kind of transitions into that sense of self in adulthood, and it becomes much, much more rigid. There's very little fluctuation in adulthood like we see in adolescence. So you might see a teenager, at one point hanging out with a specific clique of individuals that has very defined characteristics. And a month later, they hang out with a completely different groups of individuals. They're exploring those possible selves, exploring different options. This same thing doesn't very often happen with adults. They usually find their specific pattern of communication, their way of hanging out with individuals, who they like, what they like, and there's very little change once we reach adulthood. It's kind of early 20s into 30s, 40s, and beyond. There's very little change in that person's personality as they progress throughout their lives. However, when we look at what the sense of self is, we see much more complexity, even though there's not much more change, in this concept of the self in adulthood. One of the things we see is an emergence of something called alternative selves. And that's the recognition that not only do we have a current person that we are, an ideal self, or that person we'd like to be, but we also have different selves based on different contexts. So when I'm with my friends, I act this way. When I'm with my family, I act this way. When I'm with my children, usually when we get into adulthood, we have children. When I'm with my children, I act this way. And that recognition of alternate selves, or multiple selves, is something that's very common in adulthood. And with that comes a recognition that sometimes these different types of selves don't always align with each other. In fact, oftentimes when we reach adulthood, a lot of people recognize that there's sometimes contradictions with how we behave. So a parent might behave irresponsibly when they're with their friends. So they might drink too much, they might go out, they might stay out too late, but when they come home and they see their young children, they might behave very differently. They might be extremely responsible, they might be extremely rigid, they might follow very regimented patterns of behavior, and those contradictions are recognizable to adults. They see when they're contradicting themselves, and they're comfortable with it. They kind of accept those contradictions from time to time. As teenagers, contradictions are something that we don't like to see. We like to be seen as consistent not only in our own mind, but with our friends. But as we age, it seems to be something that we become more comfortable with, even though not all people typically have these contradictions, but most people do have contradictions in themselves, and most people become capable of handling those contradictions fairly easily. But despite the fact that we have these alternate selves, and despite the fact that we're more accepting of these contradictions, one thing that's surprising when we look at self-studies in adults is that even though we've got all these different perspectives of who we are, a lot of times these perspectives aren't nearly as accurate as we'd like to think. So there's not as much consistency in personality and the self as a lot of us assume we have. And a lot of times, just as when we look at young children, our perspectives of who we are isn't really that accurate. I guess if you're thinking of a quote to kind of identify what this means, if you think of the game that people talk, so, I'm very adventurous, I'm very outgoing, or I'm very smart, that game people talk, and say that blind date example that we had earlier, very often doesn't match the actual game or the actual behaviors of self that we actually display, the common game we walk. And there's a number of cases that I'm sure all of you can think about where we see that mismatch between how people kind of portray themselves and how they actually behave. For me, a classic example of this happened a few years ago when I sublet from a renter who, in her email, described herself as very outgoing, very friendly, loved to climb, loved to do the outdoor stuff. And, from my perspective, when I was subletting from this couple and living downstairs, I thought this would be a great match. When I moved into the apartment, I found out that these people had been outside for multiple years, and that they went to bed at 9 o'clock, and if there was any noise after that point in time, they were very upset and very disturbed. Well, obviously, there was a very stark contrast between this way this lady was portraying her and her husband and their actual behaviors. And this is something that's very common with adults. We come up with this story of who we are, and oftentimes we neglect recognizing who we actually are. We believe in the story even if our behaviors doesn't really match that story. But as we get older, we get a little bit more consistency in our perspective, and especially when we get into our later years. And we also start to form a self that looks not only at kind of the different situations that we behave in, but the current self that we actually are. So we recognize that myself in my later years, 50s, 60s, 70s, is different from myself in my earlier adulthood years. So we start talking about past selves, my junior high self, my high school self, my early adulthood self, and we recognize that those are multiple selves that really aren't indicative of the person that we are in our later years. And this is kind of the final evolution of the self, the recognition not only that we can behave differently in different situations, but we've been different people throughout our life. With respect to this concept of self-development, what we can also see when studying the self is that there's actually some subcomponents to the self that also emerge and change as we age. One of the major concepts to the self, one that I'm sure all of us are familiar with, is this concept of something called self-esteem. So our overall perception of the quality of the person that we are with respect to others. So we see ourselves as good or bad or capable or incapable based on our comparison to other individuals. And what we see when studying different cohorts, and when we see studying people over longitudinal studies, is that self-esteem is something that actually changes with age. And in fact, it changes very often in a very predictable manner. When we look at very young children, especially people before they reach their teenage years, we see a very inflated sense of self-esteem. Most kids love themselves. Most kids think of themselves as amazing when they're young. On a scale of 1 to 5, most kids typically rate themselves as around a 4. But as we reach our teenage years, that self-esteem level drops dramatically. And it's not until our 40s that sense of self-esteem actually rises back up to the 3.5 to 4 range on a scale of 1 to 5. And after getting into our later years, where we start to lose our ability, once again, a lot of our self-esteems tend to drop. And that usually is related to kind of that inability to maintain a lot of physical ability, cognitive ability, and really even take care of ourselves. But this predictable pattern of self-esteem is something that's really amazed researchers for a long period of time, because we know that as we age, we're deriving self-esteem, at least we think from this, that as we age, we're deriving self-esteem from different sources, and it's changing the way we look at ourselves in a fairly consistent pattern. And when we look at where self-esteem is coming from, what we see across most groups is that it's typically linked to happiness levels, levels of depression, and also perceptions of attractiveness. So if we think of ourselves as more attractive, we typically perceive ourselves as having a higher level of self-esteem. And if we're happy with our life and happy with what's going on, then our self-esteem is usually much, much higher. Now, we don't know if one is causing the other. We don't know if happiness is causing a high self-esteem or high self-esteem is causing happiness, but we do know that there's a link to these two things. Surprisingly, what we don't see is a link between overall ability, overall well-being and health with self-esteem. And that is something that was really surprising to a lot of researchers that looked at self-esteem studies, because we believed especially when we look at that jump in later years, that maybe this self-esteem jump is based on a growth in ability and a growth in capability. But it doesn't seem to be linked when we look at an individual-to-individual basis and overall ability. We don't see that link between self-esteem and overall ability or overall health. That being said, when we look at these kind of changes in self-esteem, what we also see when we study other cultures is that there's dramatic differences in overall levels of self-esteem from culture to culture. In particular, when we look at our Western culture in the United States, we see an extremely inflated level of self-esteem throughout our entire lives. And if we think about this chart, a scale of 1 to 5 in people's overall level of self-esteem, we see that even in our darkest days, even when we're very sad in our teenage years, people still think of themselves as better than a large proportion of the population. Right? 3.3 out of 5 is still fairly high. That means most of us are somewhere between 3 and 4 on a scale of 1 to 5 in self-esteem. Now, there's exceptions to that. There's always people with very low self-esteems and people that are struggling with things like depression that lowers their self-esteem dramatically. But on average, a huge portion of our population thinks of themselves as very amazing throughout their entire life. And that kind of high inflated self-esteem might be good in some situations, but sometimes it causes a lot of problems, especially when people get, I guess you would say, called out. So when people say that their behavior isn't matching the way they perceive themselves, that can usually cause a lot of conflict and defensiveness because people usually do have an extremely high inflated sense of who they actually are. But even if people are inaccurate, this development of self-esteem, this kind of change in how we perceive ourselves, is definitely linked to developments and in particular to our progression throughout our life. Another thing that we see that relates to this concept of self is our growth in something that we call self-regulation, the ability to really control our behavior to match up with ourselves. So when we see ourselves as being adventurous, one of the big things we have to see is that our behavior actually is indicative of us being adventurous, or that we at least have the ability to be adventurous if we'd like to be seen as adventurous. And what we see in a number of studies is that this ability to self-regulate seems to grow through a large portion of our life, and only in our later years does our self-regulation in one aspect actually decline. And when we look at the benefits of self-regulation, the ability to control things, we see a lot of really good things that are associated with this growth in self-regulation. One of the things that allows us to do is commit very appropriate behaviors to how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive ourselves as needing to act in specific situations. So we can be more representative of who we think we are, and we can behave more appropriately when we have increased levels of self-regulation. And as we age, what we see is that there's usually a trend for most people to increase their self-regulation. However, self-regulation is very low in infancy, childhood, and even very, very late adulthood. And self-regulation is sometimes low for people throughout their entire lives. In fact, self-regulation is a specific aspect of the self that varies dramatically from person to person. So there's some people that have amazing self-regulation. We kind of looked at that a little bit when we talked about Walter Mischel's delay of gratification study. And then there's other individuals, the ones that grab that marshmallow in Walter Mischel's delay of gratification study, that can't self-regulate at all. They don't know how to act appropriately. They don't know how their behavior really is indicative of their personality. And oftentimes they don't have the ability to even recognize how their behavior indicates their personality. And this happens to a large portion of the population, actually. And we see in these studies on self-regulation that there really is some stark contrast between individuals with respect to this specific ability. As we age, as mentioned earlier, self-regulation often does decline, but it's only one type of self-regulation that seems to decline. In particular, it's our control of our environment. It's called primary control. And primary control deals with people's ability to kind of choose the home they want, choose the environment they want. And what we often see with old age is that as our health declines, a lot of these abilities are often lost. We can still control our interactions. We can still control the people that we hang out with and the way we interact with people when we are around them. But control over our environment tends to decline when our physical and cognitive abilities decline. Things like driving a car becomes almost impossible to do, obviously, when we can't see, we can't hear, and we can't react effectively. So self-regulation does decline in old age, but it's only one type of self-regulation, that primary control, that seems to decline when we get into our later years. That marks the end of the first half of this class, where we talked about this overarching idea of the self. In the second half, we're going to be focusing in on this concept of identity, where our theories come with this idea of identity and how it emerges. And then after talking about identity, in the second half, we're going to be talking about personality, and how personality grows and becomes more complex as we age. Take a few minutes off, come back, and we'll be continuing on with this idea of the self.